this is a different kind of book for me because it's much more narrative driven, which I really enjoy doing. My editor said make sure you show rather than tell. And so having good stories to write about to make the concepts, resonate is really important to do, because hope is one of those really big words that can mean so many different things, has been used in so many contexts, many of which I would say are deeply troubling contexts. And so to have the concept grounded in the lived experience of people was really important to do in this book.
Welcome back to the ecoChristian podcast. I'm your host, Caleb Cray Haynes, and we're exploring what it means to be Christian on planet Earth. What comes to mind when you hear the word hope? For many of us, that term embodies many different things right now, am I right? Especially in the wake of a myriad of environmental crises. It's interesting the way we talk about love. You can be in love, but we don't talk about other things like that, like being inside of it. But I wonder if you can be in hope in the same way we can be in love. That there is a loving inness to hope. Well, friends, I gotta confess, I've been kind of geeking out on this one because you're about to hear from one of the best thinkers, writers, and teachers on the intersection of Christian faith and the environment. I'm sitting down with the Norman Wirzba to talk about his new book that just came out, Love's Braided Dance, Hope in a Time of Crisis. I hope that you'll join us with an open heart for this conversation because it's so good. So find a cozy spot to listen and let's get into it. Yeah, no, I'm so excited, and honestly, it's just such an honor to meet you and spend a little time with you. I seriously love your work, and I'm not even exaggerating. Like, I'm gonna pull it out right now. I have a tattered copy of This Sacred Life. It literally just lives in my backpack. I just think it's just such an important work. So
You're very kind to say that.
no, like seriously, this is just like amazing for me. Okay, friends, I'm here with my new friend, Norman Wirzba. And as I just said, I'm kind of geeking out because I just love his work. And if you don't know, Norman Wirzba is the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology at Duke Divinity School. His research and teaching interests are at the intersections of theology, philosophy, ecology, and agrarian and environmental studies. Raised on a farm in southern Alberta, Norman went on to study history at the University of Lethbridge, theology at Yale, and philosophy at Loyola University Chicago. And he is also currently the director of research at Duke's Office of Climate and Sustainability, which is so cool, and has written many wonderful books, including, as I mentioned, This Sacred Life and Agrarian Spirit. And yes, we're going to link those in the show notes. And he's married, has 4 children, and now, right, 1 grandchild.
Yeah, we have our first grandchild, Lila, and it's amazing. People told me being a grandparent's good. It's way better than good.
Oh man, that's so cool. And
Yeah,
you actually, it happened in time where you were able to dedicate your book to Lila, right?
that's right. Yeah, she was born about, 20 months ago, and that was during the time that I was writing the book. So she's been in my mind a lot as I've been
Mm,
thinking about hope, because for me, the question of hope is a tough one for young people in particular. They're
mm,
suspicious of people like me who talk about hope, and for good reasons.
mm,
And so
yeah.
thinking about my adult kids, but also this first grandchild,
Mm.
really was a powerful inspiration for writing it.
Absolutely. I mean, just recently I was with a group, and we're talking about the kind of what we're talking about here about the what gives us hope question and the framing of all that. But I always come back to my kids and of like my kids get me out of bed, well, quite literally in the morning or
Yeah,
vice versa, and but just keep me clocking in on this work. And there's something primal there.
yeah,
But yeah, I also have in my notes that you enjoy baking, cooking, making things with wood, playing the guitar, and you used to be a good athlete. So
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah,
So I thought that
yeah.
was
Those are
fun.
those are those are far gone days when I could tell my body to do something on the field and it would do it. Now it looks at me and says, "What are you thinking? You shouldn't be
That's
trying
right.
to do that
That's right.
anymore."
What kind of field is that for you?
Oh, it's a bunch. I mean, I love playing soccer and football, and I played a lot of basketball over the years.
Ah,
And
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I like playing pretty much any sport, but
Oh, that's
basketball
wonderful.
was the one I was probably the best at.
Okay. Okay. Well, if you visit Nashville on a Sunday evening, you'll have to come play some pickup soccer with me and a bunch of older men and women.
Oh,
You'll
that
just
would
have to
be
let me.
perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, right on. Well, so we're here to talk about Love's Braided Dance, which I have a copy of right here. It came in this week, and I'm so excited. Love's Braided Dance for those of you who are just now hearing about this book is a wonderful dialogue around hope and but the line "Love's Braided Dance," right, is a line from a Wendell Berry poem. And I'm curious if you just, wanted to briefly share about that and how you
Yeah.
connected with that poem. Is this something that's been in the oven for you a long time, or
Yeah.
kind of some of the things underneath? And
Sure.
I feel like you've mentioned, or I've seen you write that you either have personally interacted with Wendell Berry or through letters or something.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. We've been friends for years. I think it started when I was teaching in Kentucky. I had moved there and got to know some Kentucky natives, and I said, "Who's a Kentucky writer I should read?" And they said, "Well, you should read Wendell Berry. I think you'd like him." And I had never heard of Wendell Berry. This would have been
Mm,
around the late 90s. And
sure.
so I picked up some of his fiction and his poetry and his essays. And then when I read his book, The Unsettling of America, that was the story of our family farm, this contrast between these
Mm,
two vastly different ways about thinking of agriculture. And so
mm,
I asked my friend, I said, "Does he ever have visitors?" And they said, "Well, he doesn't like academics too much." So I wrote him a letter and said, "I'm a farm boy and I'd love to meet with you at some point." He's only an hour away from where I lived. So
wow.
he wrote back this lovely letter and with a map that he drew and said, "Yeah, come on out this Sunday
No,
afternoon." And
no way.
so went out there and yeah, we became good friends and did some work together with the Community Farm Alliance and with the Sierra Club. And I did a conference with his work. And it's just been a marvelous, what I would call my second major education. So I had the whole education where, I did a history degree, theology, and philosophy. And there was never a farmer on the syllabus. And I thought farming was completely out of my life. And then meeting Wendell and reading his description about what agricultural life means for culture, that became a way for me to rethink so much of what I had been thinking in philosophy and theology. And he introduced me to a whole bunch of agrarian writers and really got me to read scripture in a fundamentally new way because the world of scripture is an agricultural world. And, we don't pay attention to that. And it's important that we do exactly that so that we can understand not just the presence of God in the world, but also the work of God in the actual world. Because so much Christianity, it seems to me, is about your soul. And it's very spiritual, ethereal kind of thing where it seems like the aim of spiritual life or faithful life is to get your soul to heaven far, far away. And that just seems so misguided when you read scripture and you see how God is present to the world, present in the world, and concerned about saving, redeeming this world. So that gave me a whole new orientation. And I've been working that out in virtually all the writing that I've been doing in my career. And so when I was thinking about hope, I knew exactly that hope was going to depend upon establishing connections and relationships and making them good ones with people, but also with our places. And I've long loved this poem by his called In Rain. And where the title comes from is this verse where he says, the way I go is marriage to this place, love's braided dance covering the world. And that's exactly the movement that I think we're going to need, because we can't ask people to be hopeful in a world that is being systematically degraded or destroyed or abandoned.
Yeah.
And we can't be hopeful in a world where people and communities are also being degraded or abandoned. And
Mm,
so to develop this kind of relationship where we're constantly negotiating how best to be with each other, that becomes a kind of dance. The best
mm,
way that can happen is when we learn the skill sets that love makes possible.
mm. Wow. So good. Yeah, it seems, and kind of like you mentioned earlier, this seems to be a book about reframing hope, and in which I found really refreshing. And often after, I do a talk somewhere or something, I feel like there's always like that person who comes up after, you've just spent however long
Yeah.
talking about all of this, who's like, but really, like, let's get real, and starts quoting all the reasons why we're doomed, or
Yeah.
whatever. And after so many times of this happening, I kind of realized they're kind of after, or they're curious if I have this like silver bullet of hope kind of thing.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the reasons I really love this work here, because it's you're kind of saying that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder if you'd be willing to peel a
Sure.
layer here for us and share some thoughts on this sort of shift of how we typically speak of hope as
Yeah.
the ends rather than hope within the means.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a really important question, because a lot of people want to say we can't have hope because we're waiting for the silver bullet and the silver bullet's not coming.
Mm,
And that's a real problem,
mm,
because why would we think that hope depends upon having the grand solution?
mm,
Um, there's real danger, I think, when we take that approach, because that means we are basically putting ourselves in a position of passivity where the great solution is going to come and that's going to fix everything. And that
mm,
that puts hope more in the register of optimism. Optimism says, okay, yeah, things are rough, but just hang on, it's going to get better. And it's going to
mm,
get better because, either technology is going to save us, Elon Musk
right,
is going to save us, or
right.
God's going to save us.
Mm,
And I think those are all terrible approaches, because I don't think God ever, I mean, just look at the Gospels. Does Jesus ever say to somebody when they're in the midst of their suffering or pain or whatever, hey, just
mm,
hang on till you die and then it'll be okay? Or, God's got this, just don't worry about anything. No, Jesus invites people into a life of discipleship, because it's as we participate in God's love that's active already in the world. And that means committing to healing the world, fixing the world, repairing the brokenness, building
mm,
relationships, reconciling differences, all the things that we
mm,
see Jesus doing in his ministries. As we do that, we actually counteract the kinds of conditions that create despair and hopelessness in the first place, right?
mm,
Hope is not about waiting for somebody else to come along and fix our mess.
mm,
Hope is about engaging the world, not knowing
mm,
how it's all going to work out, because none of us know that. It means engaging the world in such a way that even when it's really hard, love requires that we stay committed, because
mm,
love does not know the outcome, and love is not the kind of power
mm,
that is coercive. Uh,
mm,
Love is that humble power that Jesus manifests, which is get yourself involved and see how you can be a helping presence, a nurturing presence,
mm,
rather than a damaging presence.
mm, mm. Yeah, and you mentioned this kind of movement away from even from the question, like what gives you hope?
Yeah,
Um, because even in that question, the question kind of seeks an object in that narrative.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, some people think, what gives you hope? It makes it sound like some people have it, some don't. And if you're lucky, you have it. And then the assumption seems to be that if you have it, it's sort of like a vaccine. And if
Mm,
you got the vaccine, you're not going to get the disease.
mm,
And I just don't see hope that way. I don't think hope is a vaccine that protects us from the world. Hope is a power. It's an action. It's a way of being that involves you in the world so that you can try to figure out what would it look like if love goes to work in this situation.
Mm,
And when you are committed to participating in God's love that's already active in the world, right?
mm,
What you do is A, you're no longer just a passive bystander, and B, you're contributing to making the world better, which is what's going to inspire people to want to commit to doing the things that make this world better. I think too much of what happens in our culture today reduces us to either consumers or passive spectators. We
mm,
watch or we shop. And
mm.
and those are two ways of disengagement rather than engagement. And
Mm,
it seems to me that people who are in churches, that's precisely what they're about. They're figuring out how to engage with each other, with their communities, and with their
mm,
places in ways that witness to the love of God.
mm. Yes. I love the watching and shopping. That's so true. I My wife sent me a video from a comedian today who was like, we've got to be honest, the end of the world is coming, and we at least we can say that we all did our best. And we all at least got reusable bags, and and then that was it.
Yeah.
I thought that was really funny, but
Yeah.
that's what it feels like sometimes. Yeah, and then I love what you said about optimism actually working against hope versus the actual like work of carrying our cross in the midst of a community and embodying this
Yeah.
this gospel and this work. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so good.
Yeah. I mean, the shortest way to put this is to say that Jesus was not an optimist.
Mm,
Jesus didn't say, "Hey, don't worry, it's all
mm,
going to be okay."
mm,
Jesus doesn't never say that.
mm,
Jesus is fully prepared to see that things are going to be really bad for him and for his community
mm,
because there are lots of powers like the Roman Empire. They're not interested in what Jesus is talking about.
mm,
And so Jesus is not an optimist, but
mm,
Jesus is the inspiration for our hope
mm,
because he exercises the kind of love that heals the world. He
mm,
exercises the kind of love that nurtures the world. And it's precisely in healing and nurture that we see that this world is worthy of our cherishing, that this world is worthy of our commitment to care for it. And when we do that, it actually creates a much more inviting world because it's a more beautiful world. It's a more fragrant world, right? Those are the kinds of places that people want to find themselves in, right? Who wants to live in a world that's been degraded or abandoned or abused or exploited, right? None of us want that. But the powers that be in our culture, whether those be the business leaders or the politicians or whatever, that's the world they're giving us. And so it's not surprising that so many younger people, they're just feeling so despondent because when they look around and see neighborhoods that are exploited or abandoned, or they look around and they see forests that are just being decimated and clear cut, or they see agricultural fields that are just laced with poison, right? They look at
mm,
all that and they say, clearly, nobody cares about our world.
mm. Yeah.
And that's just dispiriting, right?
Mm,
And so, what if we were instead to be the kind of people who are about caring for this earth, caring for our
mm,
communities and neighborhoods? That would already change the terms
mm.
dramatically for how people either will commit or not commit to the world.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that really caught me by surprise in reading this book, I think I was kind of prepared, and you alluded to this earlier, but I was prepared for kind of another "The Sacred Life" or "Food and Faith" or something. But this book is so different, and in a good way, and because it's a book of stories, and it's a book
Yeah,
that really, I mean, even from that opening narrative,
right.
and just it really tugs on your deep heartstrings. And spoiler alert for some people, you might cry a little bit. You're gonna tear up when you read this book a little bit, because that's kind of the point. Because it's these stories, these are real people
Yeah,
who have experienced, in some cases, just really, some brutal things, and that
yeah,
connect with us on a really deeper human level.
yeah,
Because how can we talk about hope just out of this place of philosophy and theology? outside of a
Mm-hmm.
story. And this is honestly what the church has done, how we've missed so often. And it was we took something that was a story and we made it systematic and we put it in creeds and all this. And those are
Yeah.
important, but it's also a story. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I thought that that was really anyway vulnerable of you to on one end you're saying here's these stories. Here's the need is to be vulnerable, and then you actually share your own story to your family and their journey from
Mm-hmm.
Poland and Germany and Canada and the
Right.
pain there. Was that
Yeah.
was that kind of a you knew going into it this was going to come out or
Yeah. I mean, I think, as I knew I was going to write a book about hope, I didn't know exactly how it was going to work because, as I've already said, there's so much suspicion about hope. So it wasn't
mm,
going to be just sort of standard description about the virtues of hope or whatever. But I knew it had to be stories. And the first story that I realized would really help make a point was the story I tell about Don and Marie Ruzicka,
mm,
where they come into this agricultural land and they see how their sort of conventional practices are destroying the land, killing the diversity of life there, and that the land forgives them.
mm,
And I remember when Donna Marie told me that story. I mean, it was just such a striking story because we don't think about land forgiving us or
mm,
creatures forgiving us, but that's exactly what they felt happened. And so I wrote that story up and then did some sort of analysis of it and sent it to the editor. And she said, "You got to do that all the way through,
wow.
right? Use the stories to make the point, show rather than tell."
Mm,
Because people don't connect with just theories. They don't connect with abstractions, but they really connect with people who have a compelling experience or they have a message that's embodied in their practices and their way of being in the world. Because, hope, the danger with it is it quickly becomes abstract, or at least it can be.
mm,
And I think you need to see on the ground kinds of descriptions that show how hope is difficult, but also how hope is possible
mm,
and what that means and how that works itself out. And for me, the crucial thing was to be able to show how hope requires loving relationships. And if you can find ways to foster those, you're on your way. But then there's also the need to talk about why love is difficult, right? And so much of our culture makes love hard because we have an economy that makes us lonely. We have architectures that separate us from each other. And that's why it was important to write about economics and why it was important to write about built environments in this book, because love isn't just a feeling.
mm,
It's something that people work out in their day-to-day lives. And if their day-to-day living puts them in a place of work that's inherently degrading,
mm,
that's not going to work. Or if they're living in a neighborhood in which they're terrified
mm,
because there's so much violence, or they're living where they're not able to walk to anything, they're just feeling alone, that's not helpful either. So you have to be able to talk about practical conditions, but also practices that enable love to flourish
mm.
and show why certain practices uh, work against that kind of love and therefore against the flourishing that is the basis of our hope.
Kind of on the other side, you do spend a little bit of time talking about, Silicon Valley and Chat GBT and, and
Yeah,
data and tech and, the money
right.
and at one point you say the invention of the internet was like the arrival of the Messiah. Yes, nice.
Yeah,
And you write, life can be many things, but it should never, ever be boring. That's the current mindset. Anything less than an
yeah,
unbounded life and an unlimited self now feels like an unwarranted diminishment of human potential. And then you go on to be emotionally fulfilled means never being lonely, always being engaged and affirmed by others, being unconstrained in anger, able to multitask,
yeah,
apprehend everything. And so I wonder, this feels to me like kind of a thread that you've built on from other books and this
yeah,
intersection between the quantitative and the qualitative life
right.
around the edges here of the braided dance. And so Yeah, I wonder if you'd be willing to hone in on some of this, and how is this ultimately a conversation for us to enter into around
Yeah.
hope, trying to understand our work here as people caring for the planet?
Yeah. So I knew that I would have to write about technology in this book. One of the reasons is not that I'm opposed to all technologies. I'm clearly not. I mean, I'm on my laptop with you right now.
Mm,
So it's not to be opposed to all technology, but it is to say that right now, one of the dominant ways that people have for talking about hope is through technology, right? That technology is going to be what saves humanity.
mm,
And I hear it all over the place. I hear it all the time.
mm,
And that's one of the reasons, I suppose, that people are so excited about AI,
mm.
besides the fact that some companies are going to make so much
So
money
much.
developing, right? So technology is presented to us as the
Mm,
savior, as the source of our hope. And that to me just seems crazy
mm,
because if you just use as the sort of base example how these social media platforms that have been developed, which promise connection, are also creating these cultures in which people feel terribly alone and more anxious than ever. And, there's been so much that's been written about what these programs or platforms like Instagram or TikTok, what it's doing to children, especially young women. I mean, it's just so destructive. So the promise is connection, but the result is almost the opposite. I mean, there is a kind of connection that's happening, but it's not the kind of connection that is at all satisfying. And so the question is, well, what is it about this world of technology and its promises that is perhaps deceiving? And what I argue in the book is that the relationships we really want are not just sort of basic connections that you've got, 6,000 Facebook friends or 23 million TikTok followers or whatever number you think is the cool number to have. What people really want is a resonant relationship in which they feel themselves affirmed and then transformed from the inside. That's the thing that people most want. They want to know that they are deeply loved and cherished, and they want to know that they are invited into a relationship where they can, be themselves, make mistakes, know they'll be forgiven if they make a mistake, but also see the potential to grow, right? And this is something so, so different than what you get through like X or something like that. Because the aim, right, is not just to be connected or to be even entertained or stimulated. The aim is transformation.
mm,
And what I'm talking about is something that happens on lots of different levels, right? Think about when you have had the experience of falling in love with somebody, right? It's the kind of experience that makes your whole body feel different. Your whole emotional outlook is changed because you come in the presence of your beloved and you're just so happy. Or think about when you encounter a beautiful work of art or listening to a beautiful piece of music that just makes your body vibrate in a way that you didn't anticipate and you're enraptured. And or think about when you're out for a walk and you're just overcome by a scene or a
mm,
fragrant smell that's coming out or the beauty of, a trout stream. Or I mean, there's just so
mm,
many ways that we can describe what a really transformative, resonant experience is. That's what people want. That's when life becomes deeply meaningful and deeply satisfying. And unless we have any of that stuff, we're just going to be the kinds of folks who we have today who are constantly searching for more, having more, doing more, being more.
mm,
And we know that that just becomes a treadmill
mm,
that leads to our own exhaustion and our own disappointment. And so rather than having quantities of whatever, the key is to have the real quality of loving relationships where we know we matter and where we know we're accepted
mm,
and we belong and we can thrive together,
mm.
or at least potentially thrive together.
Yeah. I think that word exhaustion is so key, and obviously you spend a good deal of time talking about that in reference to Sabbath, which is kind of in reference to appreciation. And
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, that's such a key, I think, insight into the kind of posture change that we're going to have to really lean into. And obviously,
Hmm.
lots of authors have written whole books on the Sabbath and this sort of ecology exchange. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's just so good. In the book, you spend multiple chapters as well on forgiveness, and you tell some pretty powerful stories there. And among those stories, you talk about South Africa and apartheid, and
Yeah.
the mothers who lost their sons, and the forgiveness offered, and the notion of probably gonna say it wrong, enimba, and just
Hmm.
wow, people, you're gonna have to read it, folks. But you're just sort of uncovering how forgiveness is a deep aspect of our humanity. But even more than that, I wonder if you'd be willing to share a bit about, why this is connected to hope and this kind of
Yeah.
thing you're weaving together here.
Sure. Yeah. So if hope is about having the kinds of relationship of mutual nurture, mutual care, right? The fact is that when we try to be in relationships, we make mistakes.
Mm,
We do things that hurt each other. And to think that we're not going to do that is to fool ourselves. So that even when we're trying to be as loving and caring as we could possibly be, we still hurt each other.
mm,
And so that's just a basic fact that we all have to negotiate. So then the question is, well, what are you going to do in the face of wrongdoing? And this is why I think the whole sort of operation of forgiveness is so important because if we're not prepared to confess or we're not prepared to say sorry, we're never going to have the kinds of relationships that are deep, that are meaningful, that recognize that, we are each complex people. We are each mysteries to each other and to ourselves even. And so we can often be terribly mistaken about what we think is the best thing to do in a situation. So this posture of humility and mercy has to be a part of everything that we do in our relationships, not just with other people, but with the land and with fellow creatures, I argue too. But then we also have to do this really difficult thing of giving, granting forgiveness, right? So that when someone who has wronged us, right, comes and says, I am so sorry, I want to do better, I want to make it right, we have to be thinking, can we forgive that person? And I'm not advocating that we forgive everyone for everything because sometimes the harm is so deep that it would be wrong to ask a person to forgive someone who has been, say, abusing them for years or whatever, that you need a community to help negotiate that. But, I use the example of South Africa because it's such a powerful example. And the side of forgiveness that I bring out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is something that I hadn't heard as much about. And so I wanted to really feature that. And, thinking about these people like Nelson Mandela who were just so badly treated by his own government, sent to prison, and yet could reach out to shake hands with de Klerk and say, I cannot imagine a healed South Africa without a healing of relationships between blacks and whites. And that meant, he said, that we have to be prepared to forgive white Africans, which is just an astounding thing to say. Or, as you mentioned, these women, many of them elderly women who had husbands or children that were killed by apartheid regime, to say to the men who murdered and
mm,
abused and tortured their beloved ones, to say, I don't want to see you suffer.
mm,
I want to forgive you and I want to bring you back into the community because, as a community, we have a responsibility to
mm,
accept you.
mm,
We have a responsibility to contribute to your healing, right? And this is where just the sort of philosophical context is so different, right? So many of them appeal to this African principle called Ubuntu,
mm,
which is so different than the neoliberal
mm.
individualistic way of thinking that we have in America,
Yeah.
right? In America, if you succeed, it's all on you. If you fail, it's all on you. But in Africa, with Ubuntu, if you fail, it's a failure of the community. If you succeed, it's the success of the whole community. It's very much like what you see in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, right? Where you're a body of many members, and no member can claim to be the only important one. No member can thrive on their own, right? It's this much richer social understanding of a life so that if we're going to heal, we heal the whole thing.
Mm,
If we're going to suffer, the whole suffers. And that just takes us into a vastly different perspective where granting forgiveness is just basic. It has to happen.
mm,
But the conditions under which it happened have to be determined by the situation.
mm. I think there's, yeah, it's like we want. I feel like so much in society and looking to technology and all this, exterior whatnot for hope. It's like bypass we're trying to get to hope by bypassing the work of forgiveness. It's
Hmm.
like trying to find this easier way out, but it's like, no, ultimately, of course, this has to do with you and I being reconciled, and us in creation being reconciled, and ultimately entering back into that covenant faithfulness with
Hmm.
creation. And yeah, I just the image coming to my mind, is just kind of a clogged flow. Of course, all of this is going to fall apart. Of course, we're not going to be able to find healing as long as this flow of forgiveness is clogged up and it's closed off.
Hmm.
And all the way back to Jesus teaching us how to pray, right?
Hmm.
Forgiving our debtors precedes our debts being forgiven.
Hmm.
I don't think we should be surprised to find that this is a deeper pattern in all of this conversation. Yeah, so
Hmm.
I thought that was really powerful. So the book ends with more wonderful stories, and you're faithfully doing the work of putting flesh on embodied hope through conversations,
Hmm.
and you get into architecture and economy, and there's just so much there, and I'm tempted to get into it. But one thing that you confront is how we perceive and engage the world. A movement from seeing the world as something dead rather than alive. And I think that this is so key because it's another one of those things that's just underneath it all, that we see the world through a living lens. And I feel that this actually is naming a key hangup for a lot of Christians today. So I wonder if you could speak more on
Yeah.
the shift toward, aliveness, as you name it, as part of the greater
Yeah.
journey toward imagining a hopeful architecture and economy.
Sure. Yeah, I mean it's very, very important. And I think just the way to frame this is to first of all say, because it needs saying, that we are in this unprecedented moment in the history of humanity where so many people think the world is dead.
Mm,
This is a completely new idea in the history of humanity.
mm,
It didn't exist until about 500 years ago, and it only exists then in a smaller pocket of the world, which is the European North American context. Because indigenous peoples, agricultural peoples, hunters, gatherers, foragers, whatever, all of them understood that the world is deeply and mysteriously alive. And as soon as you start with that assumption, the world can be a place of kinship. It can be a moral community in which you have responsibilities, not just to yourself or your family, but to the living beings that you share this world with and the living beings who nurture you so that you can live, right? All of that sort of got hijacked somehow by this development of the new science. Descartes famously described it as a world just of extended stuff. It's dead. And so, most famously and horribly, he practiced vivisection, right? Doing experiments on living animals, cutting them open because he said they're just machines, they're just dead. And you think, what do you have to do in your head to think that a living creature is dead? But he did, and he convinced a lot of people that the world is dead. And as soon as you make the world dead, you also open it up to endless manipulation. You can do with it whatever you want. And that, of course, is the direct opposite of what all the other cultures have always been saying, which is you can't do with the world whatever you want because it's alive. It has sanctity, it has integrity, and you have to honor it and respect it and learn how to be in appropriate relationship with it, right? That was just the sensibility that everybody had. And then along come these new scientists who are saying the world is just dead matter in motion, and therefore we can engineer it, we can design it, we can, right, improve it, right? There's all the language that we have, and the respect for the world just evaporates and it becomes our plaything. And the sad thing to me is to see the number of Christians who think exactly that way. And in doing so, they forget what is absolutely fundamental to Scripture, which is that God is present in the created world
Mm,
all the time.
mm,
So that, like the psalmist says, if God were ever to turn God's face away from the world, everything would fall to the ground and die.
mm,
Right? So God is always present to the world. God is in relationship with the world, not just people, but
mm,
creatures, right?
mm,
That God has God's eye on the creatures. The creatures praise God in return. I mean, there's this sense that God is not just present to the world, but actively engaging with the world. And then most dramatically, I would say, and most importantly, God is present in the world as the power of life working itself out in all of creatures. So, in theology, the way this was famously put is to say that creation is from the Father through the Son and by the Holy Spirit, right? The Spirit is the breath, the animating power of God's love, and it's constantly moving through the world. And so, for Christians to say the world is dead, we can use it up, do with it whatever we want,
mm,
is just a fundamental denial
mm,
of what Scripture assumes, which is to say that the world is constantly being animated by the loving breath of God.
mm. That's beautiful. And it makes me think about I think one of the four ways that we define sinning against our neighbor, right, is objectification. Right, the
Yeah,
moment that we make our neighbor creation, human or non-human, we objectify, right? That is us sinning against our neighbor. And I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about that study. I'm sure you saw that came out maybe a month or so ago, that said we now know that over the last 50 years we've lost 73%. There's been a 73% decline in wildlife, quote
mm,
unquote. I can't even wrap my mind around that,
yeah,
and all of these things are tied together in the way that we objectify all things, even our homes. And so you kind of get into architecture, right? What is
yeah,
the actual, what does it mean to have this sort of posture toward our very buildings and the
yeah,
fabric and the way that we make up our society?
yeah. And the thing is, we have known for a long time architectural principles that are beneficial to the people who live in them. But we also know that these can be architectural principles that honor and respect the places, the literal places, the ground, the water, the temperature, where these buildings exist. And, a big feature of that was that buildings in the past were constructed by the people who lived in them. And so the idea that you would build a building that was ugly or a building that would make you uncomfortable or that make you feel isolated, that would have been dumb. But what happens in the modern period, and especially in the last 100 or so years, is that architecture and design gets taken over by specialists who are officially credentialed as architects. And what they design is determined by either abstract philosophical concepts or thoroughly determined by what bankers or investors will put in the pot. And so now you have these vast tracts of housing that have been built that are just ugly. And you think, who wants to live in those places? But they're the only places people can afford, and they're affordable because they're made so cheaply, so that even in a few years, besides feeling unhealthy in them, the buildings start to fall apart. And it's not just the houses, but so many of the big edifices that we build that reflect government or business, we don't build them with an eye to beauty. We build them with an idea to only have them do a particular function. And there's a lot of concrete, a lot of glass, a lot of steel. And when these buildings are no longer used for that one function, they're not beautiful. And so nobody wants to renovate them or repurpose them for something else, right? And you think about how historically the great buildings that have been around, they've been around for centuries because they're beautiful and they can be repurposed because we want to live in spaces that make us feel better. And that principle just went out the window when we said we're going to let bankers decide what we live in.
Yeah. Man, it's you get two feelings. You get, your soul resonates with it, but then on the other side, you're like, man, we have so much to deconstruct. It's easy to feel powerless in this whole huge conversation around climate and global environmental crises and all of that. But at the same time, circling back, I guess, is
Hmm.
that hope is something that, and maybe I'm thinking about this differently than you're writing about, but hope is the jacket that we get to put on in the morning. Hope is the gloves that we get to put on and go to work within our communities. Is that kind of fair? Is that kind of where you're some of the frame that you're
Well,
looking at?
I would say that what we do is if you want to live a hopeful life, be reminding yourself constantly of what you love, who do you love, and what are you going to do to activate that love, right? Because that then takes you out into a world with a sense that A, the people and the places I am are worthy of our cherishing. And if they're worthy of our cherishing, we can now start the job of figuring out how do I nurture?
Mm.
How do I protect? How do I celebrate what is cherishable? And as long as you're doing that, you're automatically helping contribute to a world that is inspiring for other people to join their love, right? And when, I say briefly that, hope germinates when love is born, right? And it grows when love becomes a bigger, more powerful presence wherever you are. So the focus is, you know, activating love by participating in the love that God has for the world. And when we do that, we actually create a world that draws other people in and it gives them a reason for wanting to commit to the future and to a community.
Man, so good. That's just all the things right there, and the work that's right before us. And that's kind of what I was saying, like, and that's kind of story I told earlier too, of just I'm just weary, I think, of everyone trying to say yes, but. Have you seen how big the world is? You're already missing it, right? It's right here in front of you. It's this day, it's this moment, it's this next thing that you get to do, and
Mhm.
in the way of love. And I totally agree that it's a contagion in all the good, in all the right ways. And so and that's what's so good about this conversation. That's what's so good about
Mm.
this book. And I'm just so thankful for it. I'm curious if you have maybe a favorite part or idea that you explore in the book that you'd like to leave us with.
Yeah, huh. I shouldn't say this because there's a lot of parts of the book that I really like. But I think, I think what I want people to leave with is this image that I start the book with
Mm,
of Carmine taking his hand, reaching out into the
mm,
water to grab the hand of a flailing refugee. And that grasping of hands is sort of the physical gesture, but it's also the symbol of what a hopeful world is going to depend upon. And throughout the book, I have little episodes where two hands meet, right? Nelson Mandela reaches out a hand to de Klerk, right? Or Pumla Gobodo Madikizela reaches the hand out to the architect of evil and touches his hand. I mean, it's that willingness to touch the hand of somebody else, a hand of help, a hand of nurture, a hand of support. That's sort of the image that is the one that guided me in the writing of the book. So that's I think a way to sort of summarize what I'm up to.
oh man, that's so good. Yeah, and just that original image of, your hand can't grab everyone else's hand, right? And your boat is only so big, and that's hard. It's easy just to sit here and say it, but it's also something that I think one hand at a time, it gets more joyful as you go. And yeah, I
Hmm.
think that's a great image. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing a little bit more about your book, Love's Braided Dance, Hope in a Time of Crisis. And I hope our listeners will pick up a copy. And I know that we all need more of this. So thank you, Dr. Wirzba.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Y'all, what can be said? I told you. It's going to be good. Whew. I know you're going to pick up a copy of Love's Braided Dance this week or check out any of Norman's great collection of books. And also, this is your chance to extend a hand to a friend, a family member, a neighbor, and share this conversation and begin this journey with those around you. Don't forget to click that subscribe button and continue joining me for these fruit-bearing conversations towards serving and keeping this creation we call home. Until next time, friends, much love.